Why I would love to begin with the Katha.
Sure,
Do we begin with Shivji and Parvati Ma?
absolutely. The parents of Ganesha.
Mm.
So, when we look at the emergence of any devata, when we look at the stories connected with them, what always is interesting to observe is how there is such interconnectedness. So, it's hardly ever one story with just one character and a magical appearance. They're always interlinked to multiple elements, multiple, I will not say characters, but multiple other such forces. And the story is a combination of all this. Because, and I just want to, do this priming before we launch into the story, that when we look into any story of how a devata emerged, the idea that rishis are trying to convey to us, the rishis who documented these stories, is not about an emergence that happened long, long ago and we are simply remembering it. It is about an emergence that can happen at any moment inside the sheath of this body. And for that to happen, there needs to be a recognition and an awareness of what's happening. So these stories are talking about how divinity manifests within the body, within the realm of the body. When it is happening, there is a whole lot of grace that makes it happen. How does that grace come and support the expression of divinity? I think that's the scaffolding I'd like to build before we kind of get into the story of Ganesha. Because when we look at any form of divinity, typically what happens is divinity is somewhere a little out of reach for us. Because no matter how much we try to build in the idea of love, which is a very, very simple but a very profound thing to do, there is a distance because we realize it's God. So there is some fear. Because there's an element of unknown. So what makes divinity accessible? Divinity only becomes accessible to us when divinity becomes childlike. And that is why if you see in Sanatan Dharma, every school of thought, every sub-school of thought within this system has a form of that deity in a child form. So for example, Vishnu, eternally in his realm beyond the 14 worlds, out of access for even devatas, forget human beings. How does one attempt to reach such a Vishnu? That same Vishnu becomes a small little Krishna and comes crawling into our hearts. When there's Krishna, there's no intimidation. There's no fear of, oh, how do I? So automatically a link is established. So in the school of Vaishnava, a baby Vishnu is Balakrishna. In the school of Shakta, of Shakti, where the divine feminine is worshipped and is eulogized, how do we connect with her? I'm not saying one cannot establish a connect. There are Mahans who have established connects with so many forms of the goddess. But for the goddess to become accessible, she becomes the form of Bala Tripura Sundari. So Balakrishna, Bala Tripura Sundari. Now, if you see this in Shaiva, in the school of worshipping Shiva as Paramatma, you see forms like Batuk Bhairav, which is a young form of Shiva as Bhairav specifically. But you also see two distinct forms, not of Shiva himself as a baby, but his two sons as babies. One is Bala Ganesha, the second is Bala Subramanya or Bala Kartikeya. Both of these forms have their own kathas, but they make Shiva and his entire family accessible to us. Just like how Krishna does that and makes Vishnu Tattvam accessible to us. So Ganapati's appearance itself, Subramanya or Kartikeya's appearance itself is the link to unravel the mysteries of how to connect with God. Because with children, there's no fear. And that also ties into what we were talking about earlier, about the idea that you can play with Ganapati. You can dress him up how you'd like. You can paint him how you'd like. You can engage with him in whatever way speaks to your heart because he's a child. And this child, when he first appeared to his parents, so the parents of the world, Parameshwara and Parvati, Shiva and Parvati. If you're in the Vaishnava school of thought, it's Vishnu and Lakshmi. These are forms, but the ideology is remaining the same. These are the parents of the universe. Now, the parents of the universe, Ganapati is born to them as their child. This is the statement we all somewhere are familiar with, that they have two children. One of them is Ganapati, the other is Kartikeya. But Puranic stories are never so linear, because if Ganesha is born to them as their child, it makes sense till the point that we read stories pertaining to their wedding. That is when Shiva and Shakti came together, when Shiva and Parvati came together. When they came together, they also worshipped Ganapati at their own wedding. So how is it that they worshipped their own child who was not yet born? So there itself, the story is hinting it's not just about a child being born to them, Puranic terminology uses these words like child, wife, etc. as a code for something else. So the idea of Ganapati is that Ganapati is the primordial sound that we call as Pranava or Om. From this Om stemmed the entire universe. Shiva and Parvati both desired that this Om should be born to them. That desire leads to a very beautiful and a very elaborate story of how he came to be. This is the most common one. What I'm going to narrate now is one amongst the multiple. There are so many of them because these stories are trying to communicate one point, that don't restrict God's appearances and believe that this is the only way in which divinity can manifest. This is one way. And in this one way, you'll see something very interesting. It's also pointing my attention to that very beautiful Vigraha over there, which we'll tie it all up in a minute.
Placed very specifically for this
Yes,
episode.
exactly. So what you see in this story is that Parvati desires to have somebody guarding her door and being her attendant, somebody who will respond to her and her needs. So out of her own skin, she takes out, some people say the multani mitti, some people say that she uses haldi, and she fashions a little boy. Now, this is coming from her. So Puranas are using this as codes, saying it's an extension of that Shakti. And by virtue of Shakti herself doing it, because Parvati is Jagannatha, she pours her own prana into it. Her own prana Shakti falls into it. Her own prana Shakti gives it life. So this little boy that she fashioned comes to life. When he comes to life, she assigns him a task and she says, be at my door and don't allow anybody to come. Now the boy is on duty. She has gone in. And meanwhile, Shiva appears. Now the boy has not been acquainted with him. So he doesn't know who he is. Shiva wants to go inside and the boy says, no, you don't have permission to go inside. My mother has said nobody is allowed. You're a part of that. There's no exceptions. So Shiva, in a moment of what seems like anger, and we can be very quick to dismiss these stories saying, oh, so Shiva gets angry. But there's a reason behind this. So Shiva gets angry and he cuts the boy's head with his Trishulam, which also interestingly is here. So I feel like all elements of your story are all finding their way here. So he cuts his head. And as soon as this news reaches inside, Parvati is furious, saying, that's my child. I created him out of my own hands. And he was killed. So now I'm going to take out that rage and kill the rest of creation. And she is appeased only when Shiva says, I will go and I will find the head of an animal that is sleeping in the northern direction. And I will place the first animal that I see, I will bring its head and I will put it here. Now this is when the story becomes very interesting, because Shiva goes to the forest and he sees an elephant head, comes and places that elephant head on this decapitated body and then pours life into it. And he gives him the special place of Agra Puja, of Prathama Puja, saying, henceforth, anybody in this world who has to attain success in whatever their endeavor is, they must first pray to you. And then not only will they not have any obstacles, they will be able to achieve their end goal. This is the idea. This is the basic story of how Ganapati's appearance happened. This is one of the many stories. This is not the only one. But look at the story. It's hinting at some strange things. Why is an elephant's head there? They could have found any animal. Shiva could have found any animal when he went to the forest. But elephant in Sanskritam is called Gaja. So he is called Gajanan, Gajamukh, etc. But something special in that form which ties into the idea of who Ganapati is. So we'll come to that in just a little while. This story of how Ganapati came to be is a rather interesting one, because if you see this story, it is when he was first created. It's only Shakti. Parvati is involved entirely in this. Shiva is not involved in that creation. Shiva's involvement only comes later when he places the head. So Shiva and Shakti that you see as two separate identities, two separate entities. In Ganesha, the body is given by her, the head is given by him. So there is Parvati and Shiva here, so he is Ardhanarishwara. So worshipping Ganapati is equivalent to worshipping both of them together. Now just flip the coin and look at his brother, Muruga, Kartikeya, Subramanya, whatever name you call him by. He has 6 heads. He's called Shanmukha. Shiva technically has 5 heads. Each of them have a different name. They are associated with different concepts. Parvati has 1. 5 plus 1, 6. 6 heads you worship together. You worship that 6-headed boy. It's equivalent to worshipping his parents together. So the idea that both their parents' energy is entirely contained in them is represented both in Ganesha and in Kartikeya. You have stories that build onto this and explore this philosophy of Ganesha more. But one version claims that the event of his getting the head from Shiva and then Shiva merging it happened on the day of Bhadrapada Shukla Chaturthi. That is in the month of Bhadrapada, the 4th day before Purnima. On that day is when he received this blessing, and that is why we celebrate Ganesh Chaturthi, which is what all of this is about.